presentation, just giving an overview of the review of land for housing and some of the key findings. And while I'll talk through the review and its process, I think the main aim's to get some feedback and idea today from you to have a discussion, but also I hope, as Trevor alluded to, there can be a number of more interactive workshops if there's interest and support for that can hopefully allow us to refine and develop some of the final recommendations from the review. So what I'm going to cover today, talk about why we undertook the review and how it came about, touch on something that I'm sure you'll all be aware of, and that's the wider impacts that quality of housing and place can have. Then I'll run through the content of the review and the different individual components that made up the final report, run through the main findings, and then conclude by talking about what we feel should be the key principles to reform the housing land market to achieve better outcomes, and then briefly run through the 5 specific recommendations before we can go on to have a discussion about next steps and possible future engagement. So as background, the Land Commission was formed in 2017, and one of the first pieces of work the Scottish Government asked us to do was to undertake a review on the potential for land value capture. And this report in turn led to work on public interest-led development. And what these 2 pieces of work really were looking at was how you can move from a system that arguably is very much largely operated in the market interest to make it more about public interest outcomes. And from those, the review of land for housing really naturally flowed. And the final point to mention is that in the most recent programme for government, or before the one for this year, one of the things we were asked to do was to look at the link between land and the economy, and given the impact of affordability of housing and of increasing house price inflation on the economy, we see the review of land for housing as being key to that. So briefly, the reasons we undertook the review, we believe that in Scotland, we're not delivering enough homes to meet housing need and demand, and there's been a number of reports over the year that quantify that. There's concerns about the affordability of homes, but also choice in terms of size and location. And particularly really as a result of the pandemic and changes in people's lives, there's a lot of interest in the quality of places that we're creating and access to green space. And just a couple of slides briefly to underscore the point about housing need. This one's on household projections, and it really illustrates that while Scotland's population's forecast to grow relatively slowly, actually, as we as a population live longer and more of us live on our own or in small households, there's going to be increased household formation. So, there's definitely a need to step up in terms of delivery. And this slide, it's just a bar chart showing housing completions that's produced by the Scottish Government. And what it demonstrates is that in spite of significant investment by the Scottish Government, which is very welcome, in social house building programmes and in help to buy schemes, we actually aren't yet delivering the number of homes that we were before the last recession. So there's a real challenge there, and I would argue that means we need to think about the role of land and how we deliver new housing and places. And briefly, maybe stating the obvious to this audience, but housing, it's not just about delivering numbers or about price. It has a much bigger impact on big policy issues. I mentioned the economy, where homes are built and the types of developments, the impacts on climate change and active travel. The Scottish Government have had an aim to repopulate rural areas, and affordable housing's key to that. And of course, quality housing in place is key to health and well-being. So this is just a quick overview of the different pieces of work that over 2.5 years made up the review. So the first couple of pieces of work were reports looking at the way the land market and private house building interact. There was research on land and its role in delivering affordable rural housing. We undertook a number of case studies on the Centre for Collaborative Housing Evidence based at Glasgow University, produced a report based on that. There was another piece of research that looked at the benefits of early community engagement. We carried out a piece of work that sought to learn lessons on housing and placemaking from a number of countries in Western Europe. And also throughout the review, there was a good deal of in-depth stakeholder engagement. And before I get into talking about the content of the review and findings, I just wanted to share this slide because particularly early on in the review, I found that these two, I suppose you would call them silver bullets, but these two popular solutions to how you solve what a lot of people call the housing crisis came up. The first one, it might be put forward by house builders or by right-wing commentators, and that's really that any shortage of housing or a lack of affordability is down to bureaucracy, and you just need to free up the market. And the second one, I suppose, comes from the opposite point of view, and that's arguing that actually, if we went back to allowing local authorities to purchase land at existing use value, then the value that's generated and captured would essentially create better places, fund affordable housing, and that would solve the problem. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the two arguments, but it's just that it illustrates to me that the debate can be quite polarized, I think, in Scotland and in the UK, and certainly from working through the review and the different reports. I think if either of these solutions could work and be as simple as they are, then we'd probably have solved the housing crisis or challenge or whatever you want to call it by now. And I think it's more complicated than that. So to move on then to talk about some of the reports and their main findings, first couple of pieces of research we commissioned looked at land and house building and how the land market operates for volume house builders who, deliver the bulk of new homes in Scotland. We'd actually started off looking to investigate whether land banking was responsible for a shortage of housing, but I wanted to share some of the wider findings too. So at heart, the report found that land promotion is itself risky and time consuming. And so in order to mitigate that risk and also maximize shareholder return, this has led volume house builders to focus on developing high value homes in high value areas. We also found that in order to meet target sales prices and secure land, the model tends to be characterized by slow build-out times. So you might see an announcement that 3,000 homes are going to be built in an area of Scotland, but actually it might be quite a number of years before the final home is actually completed. They also focus on larger greenfield sites, and that particularly is the case following the last recession. Brownfield land seen as risky, and there's less SMEs building out smaller sites or gap sites. And a final finding for this slide was that the house building model just isn't really suited to increasing supply or making homes more affordable. And I suppose that makes sense. Their duty is not to the public interest, it's to their shareholders. Another findings from that research, we didn't find evidence of developers banking sites with planning permission. Rather, they were managing the process and the risk. But there was a lack of clarity and information on raw land, so land that could be optioned but didn't yet have planning permission. We found that under the prevalent spec model, developers take the risk, but also means they take the reward, and that arguably determine the outcomes. And I suppose this is just reflected in the report that Cash produced last year that said that the quality of new places in the UK remains stubbornly low. So to move on then to talk about our work on land for rural housing. I don't know how clear you can see this slide, but I think Trevor's going to send out the slides to everyone later. But really what this slide shows from research that Savills conducted is that for the private house building model, you need a certain level of return and a certain level of land market value before they will operate. So that really goes back to my previous slide saying that this means that private house building's focused on growth areas around cities. And it means that other areas like rural Scotland or town centres or regeneration areas aren't benefiting from housing investment and aren't having homes built, even though they may well need them. And some of the findings on that report were it's a big challenge developing rural housing. The report said it could be, harder to build 5 houses in a remote area than to develop 100 house site in a city. And because developers aren't active, that means that other players have got a really big role if you're looking to deliver affordable housing or housing at all. We produced actually 5 case studies, but one in particular around Applecross, I think was interesting because it produced a potential model for how local place plans could work and arguably how a more rural idea of the 20-minute neighbourhood could be. And that was because the place planned with Highland Council working with the community and the landowner and to look at the whole place and actually think where would houses best be and what other amenities are needed to allow the place to meet its potential. And the final conclusion of the report was there was a need for funding, resources and expertise to support communities. This was supplied very well by some of the rural enabling organisations, but the report argued that actually to build the homes that were needed, there needed to be a more centralised form of support that could be made available. So the next report I wanted to briefly discuss was the case studies that the Centre for Collaborative Housing Evidence, produced for us. And they looked at the role of land and housing across Scotland to try and tease out and understand actually what factors could lead to better outcomes. And we selected 5 sites in discussion with stakeholders that had a mix of characteristics. Some of them were greenfield, some were brownfield. Some of them were led very much by the public sector, whereas others were led by developers or private owners. And we had a few key findings. One was in the various instances where the local authority played a really active role and helped to lead on land assembly or perhaps infrastructure that led to better outcomes. There were also noted advantages to brownfield development in terms of access to public transport and amenities. Whether it was a public or private sector lead promoter, where there was a patient capital approach rather than a look for a fast return, that led to greater social value. And finally, across all of the case studies, where master planning and quality public space were looked at and planned for from the outset, that led to better outcomes. This is just an aerial view of Anderston in Glasgow, which was redeveloped by Sanctuary Housing Association in partnership with Glasgow City Council. And some conclusions from the report on what appeared to work well in Scotland. In-depth community engagement led to better outcomes, and I mentioned we have a full report on the experience of developers on that and the fact that it led to better outcomes and support for development. The report found that to deliver a variety of models of housing and meet wider needs, there needs to be a variety of sites and development plans. And I suppose the final point, and I echoed a previous report from maybe 10 years ago from one of our commissioners, Professor David Adams, and that was, I think many people in Scotland know what works best and wouldn't be surprised by the cash report. But then there's the question of then, why are some of these exemplars like the Commonwealth Games Village exceptional rather than more standard? So that question really in conclusion led us to do research where we were looking to learn as far as possible lessons from European countries that have a strong track record. And so we commissioned a piece of research from Glasgow and Liverpool universities. It looked at the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, but I could only fit 2 of them into an iconic image. And briefly, the research found that for each of these countries, there were better outcomes in them in terms of housing and placemaking than in the UK. And underpinning these outcomes, there was a proactive role for the public sector. But leading on to that, it was about collaborative working. It wasn't about a model where the public sector really controlled delivery. It was more, it played its role in allocating and assembling land, taking risk, but in return for that risk, looking for better place outcomes. And then the private sector played its role in terms of assessing viability and then actually delivering. And there were a variety of tools that were used to assemble land and make it development ready that were fairly common across the 3 countries. That was the use of preemption rights, public bodies having active land policies, an approach to mandatory land readjustment that was really about ensuring that, I suppose, infrastructure was funded from land values, and also each country tended to have clear rules on land value capture that developers and landowners understood. And this just shows the three case study areas, and there's quite a number of case studies available on our website if any of them are of interest. And I won't go into detail on the areas, but just to pick out a few common characteristics. One is that they were all developed on brownfield sites. And the second one, and this was a deliberate decision in commissioning the research, they weren't on huge high value sites, but they were actually on what the researchers called second order cities. So they weren't the largest cities, or they weren't necessarily in growth areas. And the final point is that the local authorities took an approach where they ran design competitions and they really emphasized the importance of the quality of green space and public space. And these were really key to the quality of the outcomes. So to conclude over the next few slides, just by highlighting some of the main conclusions, talking about the 5 recommendations that our review made, and then we can hopefully have a bit of a discussion. Just to reiterate some of the main findings of the review, private house building focuses on greenfield sites in high value areas, and so I suppose that means that's a challenge for development or regeneration in other parts of Scotland. And so we concluded that actually, if you want to deliver some of the wider policy outcomes that Scotland and the Scottish Government is looking for, such as delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods, supporting inclusive growth, and enabling rural repopulation, then there needs to be a much more proactive approach to land assembly and delivery by the public sector. I mentioned already that we found collaboration with communities, if it's sincere and early and in-depth, led to better outcomes. And that, certainly from the case studies, the best outcomes were where the public sector took a lead in land promotion and shaped markets. And a final point, that this idea might seem unusual here, but then it's relatively standard in some of our European neighbours. And so we developed some principles for what we think reform of the land housing market should look like. And one of the key ones, really maybe the main one that underpins the approach, is we think the public sector can play a more proactive role in land promotion, and it should be enabled and encouraged to do that. I think there needs, as I said previously, we need to find ways to support development in places where spec house builders don't operate. It should, though, be about collaboration. It's not about a public sector takeover. And finally, we think there should be clarity on the housing land market. Options agreements or conditional contracts should be public, and so everyone, communities, local authorities, should have clarity on where development's likely to occur. So to run through the 5 recommendations that we made in the report, I won't go into a great deal of detail on this, but the first one was to create a network of place pioneers, and the idea is that they would be early demonstrators for approaches where collaborative working by the public sector, maybe a concentration of resource, could actually help deliver development, maybe housing in town centres or in rural estates. And we proposed that local authorities can establish regeneration partnership zones as a vehicle for development in sites where there's fragmented ownership and possibly issues around land assembly. We proposed that there should be clarity on mechanisms to be used to create and capture uplift and land value. We've proposed the establishment of a Scottish land agency, and in developing that idea, I think it was possibly an idea of delivering a central point of expertise that can be supportive for development. And we had quite a lot of discussions with the Irish Land Development Agency, which has been set up in Ireland, I think, to address similar challenges. And finally, I mentioned already the idea of a transparency obligation on options agreements. So that's really the presentation, and what we're doing now is looking to disseminate the report and engage with stakeholders. But then we want to move on quickly from just sharing the report to see where there's an interest if we can develop proposals with stakeholders. And we'd very much like to do that with planning skills. And similarly, we've had discussions with Homes for Scotland around that. And we would hope to then develop place pioneer proposals and perhaps with support from Scottish Government run some demonstrator projects.